Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review. This show was recorded on July 31st, 2023. I'm Asbed Bedrossian, together with Hovik Manucharyan. We've been away for a couple of weeks, so there's a lot to discuss. So here are the major topics we're going to touch on today. We'll continue to update on the latest developments in the talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We'll discuss a little bit about Russia's and Iran's perspectives on it and more in the context of the latest meetings in Brussels and Moscow. We'll talk about the situation in Artsakh, which is dire. Now that Pashinyan has completely washed his hands of it, what are the options available to Artsakh's government under the rampant oppression of the Azeris? We'll update you on how the citizens' initiative Hayakve is proceeding. We'll give you the latest numbers. And finally, as usual, some of us will share their thoughts of the week with you. To talk about these issues, we have with us Yeghia Tashjian, who is a regional analyst and researcher based in Beirut with expertise in China, Iran, and the Persian Gulf. Tashjian is Associate Fellow at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and also a part-time instructor in international affairs at the American University for Science and Technology. Hello and welcome, Yeghia. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Yeghia.
Hello, Asbed. Hello, Vin. Thank you.
So the major news on the negotiations front this week was the meeting between Ararat Mirzoyan and Ceyhun Bayramov that took place under the auspices and mediation by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. We will cover the details of that meeting, but it is important to step back and take stock of the general trajectory of negotiations leading up to where we are today.
So summarizing the developments over the course of July, the total blockade and isolation of Artsakh has continued. And there is now talk about famine and a pretty dire situation overall. All the major and not so major international players have called on Azerbaijan to open the Verzor corridor, including the US, the EU, Russia, France, the UK, Austria, and so on and so forth, to no avail, of course, because Azerbaijan doesn't need to listen to these calls when, from the other side of their mouths, they tell Azerbaijan that there will be no consequences or repercussions to these actions. One of the things that struck me, though, was a Russian MFA statement that was several weeks back from July 15, that Pashinyan's recognition of Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan has radically changed, in quotes, the conditions under which the November 2020 trilateral agreement was signed. So, to begin with, Yeghia, is this a radical statement on the part of Russia? Can you help us understand how the Russian Foreign Ministry is analyzing the existing situation and the unfolding scenarios moving forward?
Thank you, Hovik. So basically, there is a gradual change in the Russian position, and this started when the Azerbaijanis, they installed a checkpoint in the Perzor or Lachin corridor starting December 12th. Lavrov's and actually Maria Zakharova, the foreign minister spokesperson, also hinted about this, but Lavrov said it directly that when Pashinyan in the Prague summit, I think it was October last year or November, I think October, he said it clearly that Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan and so on. So this put actually Russia in a very difficult situation because from the Russian perspective, which was to some extent also reflected in the trilateral statement of 2020, that we'll start negotiating on peace, but we will try to address the status of Artsakh issue. That is, we'll try to open the communication channels, address the issue of the refugees, exchange the prisoners of war, and so on. And later, because the status is very complicated and it may take decades. I mean, if the negotiations starting 1994 took at least 2 decades, so again, the status will take a few years, and this will also legitimize the Russian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh after 2025. However, when Pashinyan recognized that Artsakh is part of Azerbaijan, so basically as if you have kicked the third country, which is Russia, from the whole negotiation process and said that, okay, now Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, so what Russia will do? So this has put Russia in a bit difficult position. A few days ago, actually, one of my friends and political expert, Benjamin Bogosian, he wrote a very interesting article and he directly talked about this issue. The title of the article was, Russia determined not to be marginalized in the Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiation process, where his argument or concluding argument remark was that, okay, Russia wants to restore its leading role in the region because we're seeing that the Americans and the Europeans are being very active when it comes to the negotiations. So the Russians now de facto know that they cannot convince anymore the Azerbaijanis to discuss the issue of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Moreover, that the Azerbaijanis have also blockaded the corridor in Lachin. So what the Russians can do is that they also cannot antagonize the Turks regionally because we have the war in Ukraine and so on. So Russia needs Turkey and also Russia needs Azerbaijan for the North-South corridor. We can talk about this in detail later. So basically, the Russians have to give something to Azerbaijan because the Europeans and the Americans are also almost offering the same thing. That is, Armenia must sign a peace deal. Armenia must recognize Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. And then we discuss about the guarantee of the security of the Armenians. But the problem is that the Europeans and the Americans, they cannot send forces or the peacekeeping force on the ground because Azerbaijan will refuse it out of fear that the Kosovo experience can be repeated in the future. So the Azerbaijanis prefer to cooperate with the Russians because they can also use the gas card as a leverage against the Russians. So basically, the Russians will try to appease the Azerbaijanis, arguing that, look, Armenia has recognized Nagorno-Karabakh part of Azerbaijan, and in order to keep the peace and the security in the region and also secure the guarantee and the rights of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russian peacekeeping forces should be extended beyond 2025. This is very painful for us, but at the same time, it is not fully satisfactory for the Azerbaijanis. And also what Benjamin said, which I totally agree with him, that it will give a bit flexibility to the Armenians when it comes to the negotiations, that it's a like minimal acceptance, like at least when we talk about the guarantee and the security of the rights and Armenians, which the Azerbaijanis will not give. It's very clear. I mean, they want to commit a genocide. This is very clear. It's state policy. At least it will give some flexibility in the future that Armenia, if the army gets stronger, we can try to get more compromises from Azerbaijan. But again, this is super risky because when you fully recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan, as if you are going back to 1988. So this is the Russian now. I think the Russians, they know that they cannot do anything more. They are stuck in a war and their position is to some extent threatened in South Caucasus. I think they are going to this scenario.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview by John Mearsheimer today to Aaron Mate of Gray Zone. And in there, basically, Mearsheimer predicts that the Ukraine war will last a very long time. Essentially, the West will not agree to Russia to winning, and Russia obviously sees any sign of Ukrainian victory as a existential danger. So, all signs are pointing to a very long and protracted conflict in Ukraine. And one of my questions that I meant to ask you, which I think you partly or fully answered, was that how does the war in Ukraine figure in the Russian calculations? You mentioned the North-South corridor. You also mentioned Turkey's support or limited support. What else can you tell us about the war in Ukraine and how it would affect Caucasus?
Let me also add, is Ukraine becoming the new Afghanistan here?
Maybe. A new Syria or a new Afghanistan. Yesterday I was reading an article which published in the Foreign Affairs journal of the last number, not the newest one. It's called Blundering on the Brink, which talks about Cuban Missile Crisis and what lessons we can learn from it. The author was hinting that maybe in the future, the Russians and the Americans will see that, okay, no one will gonna win this war. Russia has drained a lot of resources and definitely it will not be able to occupy Kiev. And the Americans, I mean, they cannot send arms to Ukraine until the end because they have their own wars. So basically, eventually, there was also an article in the Moscow Times published a few days ago talking that there is a 1.5 diplomacy, track to diplomacy between former State Department officials from the US and high-level Kremlin officials. We don't know what will happen. There is also in the coming days in Saudi Arabia summit about Ukraine, peace, and so on, and the African leaders are trying to do. Let's not forget next year there is presidential election in Russia and in US. So something must happen until then. But the problem is that will we be able to survive until 2024, we as Armenians? From the Russian perspective, I mean, this was very clear when I went to St. Petersburg. There was the economic forum there. It was my first time participating, and we have a dinner reception with Maria Zakharova, and I asked her clearly about this issue. The aim, I mean, I wrote about this. What she said, exactly, she said that the main aim of Russia actually is to have a railway or open the communication channels in South Caucasus and link to South Caucasus to the Middle East. That is linking Azerbaijan to Iran and from Iran to Syria through Iraq. Okay, this is a very long vision. It will take at least a decade because Syria is under the sanctions. It's very difficult to bring in investments to reconstruct the railways in Syria and also Iraq. But eventually, this is the Russian idea because first you are bypassing the Black Sea. And also, let's not forget that there is the Istanbul Canal, which the Turks are trying to build. And I think it will end by 2024 or 2025. In the Bosphorus Canal, there is the Monroe Agreement between the Soviet Union and the Turkey, which is still implemented now. But with the Istanbul Canal, the new US, there is no agreement on it. So basically, NATO naval forces can enter to the Black Sea through the Bosphorus. So the Black Sea may become a new clash, arena of clash in the future. That is why actually the Russians want to bypass it and to have access to the Mediterranean Sea through the railway and not just from the Black Sea region. This would take decades. So this is here that the value of Azerbaijan is much important because the Azerbaijanis, they have a railway, they have very excellent, I can say, infrastructure compared to the Armenian side. This is why I said, like, for 26 years, we haven't invested in our infrastructure. We couldn't even finalize the North-South highway. And look what the Azerbaijanis did. And this is also like another issue that it prevents Iran to take aggressive or assertive action against Azerbaijan because Iran also needs Azerbaijan when it comes to railway connection with Russia. They have a highway connection to some extent with Russia through Armenia and Georgia, and they want to keep that. It's very important for them. But at the same time, the only railway connection with Russia is unfortunately through South Coast is Azerbaijan.
So, Yeghia, in the past weeks, there have been statements from Aliyev and Erdogan that Russian peacekeepers should leave Artsakh in 2025. There was a quick rebuttal from Moscow, basically saying that the matter was not up to Turkey to decide. Obviously, there's pressure on Russia to exit Artsakh, Armenia, and the South Caucasus in general. This seems to be the goal of the Western-mediated talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan. First of all, I was struck at how quickly Russia responded to Erdogan's comments. Is this because they've become irate with Erdogan because of the stance he took in the NATO meeting in Vilnius? Erdogan said he supported admitting Ukraine in NATO, and he's sending weaponry and drone systems to Ukraine to fight against Russia, and so on. There are even reports that Turkey is working with Ukraine behind Russia's back to export grain. What was the cause of Russia's unusually strong reaction?
So basically, there were many reasons. One of them is also the return of the Azov battalion fighters back to Ukraine, because the agreement with Turkey was that these fighters, they were going to stay in Turkey and after the war only return back to Ukraine. But I'm surprised that Russia is surprised, or maybe Russia is not surprised. Erdogan is a very flexible leader. We have to recognize that. He's very Machiavellian. He tries to analyze the balance of power. And as I always say, that Turkey is no more a bridge, but it is a central power in the region where both the East and the West need Turkey to push their own interest forward. From the Russian perspective, Russia's quick response was also something positive. It means that Russia doesn't want to leave the area. For Russia, still South Caucasus is a red line, irrespective of Russia's involvement and shifting its attention to Ukraine, but still it is recognizes that South Caucasus is part of its sphere of influence, even though it shared some parity or when it comes to after 2020 war with Turkey in the region, and Turkey's influence has highly increased, I can say. Russia this also will push maybe Russia to accelerate the negotiation process between Azerbaijan and Armenia, because Russia is very well aware that if the negotiations fail, then we are heading towards new war. And this time, the Russian peacekeeping forces were not able to defend the Armenians of Artsakh, because you cannot, like 2,000 peacekeeping force or something like this, they cannot defend the whole
perimeter.
Yeah, especially, we saw this is, I think, Russia can maximum do with these circumstances. They are even unable to unblock the road because they don't want to antagonize Azerbaijan and Turkey. So they have very limited options and they don't want to lose these cards when it comes to these limited options. So they have to do their best to please Azerbaijan, at the same time sign something a bit painful to Armenia, but it will not be so painful. I mean, like, it will not be something that will lose Artsakh completely, because from the Russian perspective, the Russians, they know very well that if they leave Nagorno-Karabakh, then their influence will decrease in the region, then the anti-Russian sentiment will rise high in Armenia, which is almost there. So it means that the next step, maybe Pashinyan will say that, okay, so Nagorno-Karabakh is gone, and we have now a corridor in Zangezur or whatever. And then, okay, we don't need the military base in Gümrü because there's no any more conditions, and we will open the border, or Turkey will open the border, and fine. So then maybe the Europeans will bring some monitoring observers in the border with Turkey and Armenia, and everything will be finished. So the Russians, I'm sure they are aware of that.
So, Yeghia, in this context of Russia trying to stay in the region and their peacekeepers, whether they stay there in until 2025 or after 2025, there were recent alarm bells rung by Iran saying that Russia or Moscow needs basically a wake-up call in the South Caucasus. What were they referring to when they said that?
So it was on July 12th, the former Iranian foreign minister, Ali Akbar Vilayati, he published an article in the Tasnim news agency, which was very interesting. He basically said that if Russia continues ignoring Iran, then there will be a great catastrophe in the region. And basically, we will be inviting, as if indirectly, the NATO forces in the region, Israel's influence will increase, and so on. And also another Iranian expert, Vali Kaleji, he wrote an article titled Russia and Iran Diverging in South Caucasus, where basically he said that Iran has some concerns. One of them, of course, was the so-called Zangezur corridor issue, which Iran opposes, because this is not just about economy and trade, but clearly it divides or it cuts the Armenian-Iranian border. And also it will increase the pan-Turkic sentiments in northern Iran. So this is a national security issue for Iran. Another issue, of course, a point that he hinted that the Russians are actually ignoring the Israeli threat in the region, keeping a low eye exactly in Syria. He said that, or he argued that the Iranians and the Russians must cooperate with Armenia, irrespective of also what kind of government we have in Yerevan, whether it's pro-Western, pro-Chinese, or pro-Russian. We have to cooperate and bring Armenia in our umbrella. This is the Iranian-Russian umbrella. Otherwise, due to Russia's policy, maybe Armenia would shift to West, and Russia and Iran will lose their influence in the region. These are some concerns, of course, the Iranians have, and they know their limitations. They cannot be involved directly in a coming war. A lot of people were saying that the Iranians would intervene and so on. My estimation is that no, Iran cannot, because Iran cannot directly clash with Turkey and Azerbaijan for Armenia. It is painful, but this is the reality. So we cannot expect that Iranian army will mobilize. But of course, Iran has many times actually offered military support, but it was Yerevan who downed this support. Of course, we know because of American and Western pressure. I'm not sure if the Armenians, they can convince the Americans to keep a low eye on this issue, but it seems difficult unless if there is support and we are not aware. Even if there is, I mean, we should not talk about this in public, of course. And also, I'm not sure what Ararat Mirzoyan, when he went to Tehran, if there were agreements signed or so on, because the Russian media were trying to ask questions and raising whether agreements were signed, but publicly I haven't heard anything. The only thing was that the Iranian foreign minister, he said that Azerbaijan gave up, or it will not implement, or it will not favor or support the Zangezur corridor project, which I was surprised.
I was also surprised about that.
Whether this was a guarantee from Azerbaijan to Iran that we gave up on this corridor. However, Aliyev keeps pushing it. Today, the Turkish foreign minister, he insisted on this issue again.
Well, yeah, there was also another report which I read. I think it said that Azerbaijan had proposed to Iran that they would never close the corridor between Iran and Armenia, which I found interesting because what they were probably proposing is that they will take over Sunik or create the Zangezur corridor, and then they will give a corridor through that land to Iran so that they can have unfettered access to Armenia.
Well, basically, maybe Azerbaijan is trying to draw a parallel between the Lachin corridor and the route in Syunik and Zang. And this was clearly, I mean, they were hinting even from October 2022.
But don't you think this goes beyond where actually they are completely reversing the corridor thing? So instead of there being a corridor between Nakhichevan and Azerbaijan, they're saying that there will be a corridor between Armenia and Iran, where today there's a straightforward border between the two countries.
When they have realized that actually Iran is against, Russia to some extent is against, and the Western world, so maybe they took a step back because, I mean, in the trilateral statement, it's very well stated that it doesn't talk or mention the word corridor, but it says that it will be unobstructed transit between Nakhichevan and the western region of Azerbaijan and guarded by the Russian border guards. So basically, it will be maybe a shared sovereignty between Armenia and Russia. It will not be fully under Armenian control. This is clear because it mentions that not the Armenian soldier or the border guards, but the Russian border guards will be. So maybe the Russians also gave something positive hints to Iran that don't worry, this will not cut. Instead, if the Russians will take control over or secure the road, maybe this will also prevent in the future Turkey to invade or Azerbaijan to invade because it will be somehow a shared sovereignty. Still, I don't like to use even this term because it's a very sensitive term.
I understand.
So maybe.
So I was a little bit concerned that in all this context, there was a statement from the Azeri Foreign Ministry, I think, that said that they appreciate Iran's balanced approach to the conflict.
Mainly because when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, Iran is silent. Iran only is responding when it comes to the so-called Zangezur corridor, but when it comes to humanitarian crisis to Nagorno-Karabakh, the Iranians are silent because I think they know that they have limitations and they don't have a say in Nagorno-Karabakh, even though the Iranian leadership knows very well that if Armenia loses Nagorno-Karabakh, then the pressure on Syunik will increase and increase more.
Okay, can we come to the recent meetings that happened? There was one in Brussels on July 15, and last week there was one in Moscow. Reportedly, in Brussels on July 15, there was not a lot of progress, at least none that was announced publicly. The main issues being discussed were border demarcation, the Berdzor corridor, the so-called rights and sovereignty, in quotes, for Artsakh, and also the so-called Zangezur corridor. So it seems that with the Pashinyan regime's approval, or at best silence, major international powers are increasingly adopting Azerbaijani talking points, and that includes Russia as well. For instance, going back to Brussels, in his statement afterwards, Michel noted the option of using Aghdam in parallel to the Berdzor corridor, which Azerbaijan is blockading. Of course, Michel didn't even use the word corridor. He said Berdzor road. Or Lachin road to be precise. Also, his omission of international mechanisms for Baku and Stepanakert dialogue was worrisome, effectively endorsing Aliyev's recommendation to supply Artsakh through Aghdam and directly deal with Stepanakert. So essentially, the world seems to be adopting Azerbaijan's policy of coercive diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Pashinyan government keeps reiterating his commitment to peace with Azerbaijan, because he said, without a peace agreement, there will be a new war. Aliyev says he plans to settle 150,000 Azeris in Artsakh. So maybe in a few days, we'll see Michel push that on Artsakh as well. So questions, Yeghia. First of all, what's with Pashinyan's frequent and repeated commitments to his era of peace? What is he communicating with these repeated statements and to whom?
So my assumption is that, first of all, war will happen. Unfortunately, maybe a limited or something big is coming before 2025. And maybe this is why the Russians are facilitating a quick dialogue. And also Lavrov said maybe an agreement will be signed by the end of 2023. It means that he is hinting. Otherwise, he would not say that. Pashinyan's peace narrative rhetoric is both for domestic consumption, but also for the Western world, arguing for the Western world that, look, Armenia is compromising, has compromised a lot. So we are okay with peace, but it is Azerbaijan that is against the peace. And for domestic consumption, arguing that, look, I'm doing my best. I'm not antagonizing Azerbaijan, and we have to compromise in order through negotiations to postpone the coming war. My concern is that, but maybe the Russians, I hope I'm wrong, they will try to give a green light for Azerbaijanis to engage with a limited clash or intervention in the Armenian border in order to force Pashinyan to sign a final treaty or a so-called peace treaty with Azerbaijan, the one that I talked in the beginning about recognizing Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan and blah blah. Because if Pashinyan will try to negotiate with the West and Moscow realizes that a deal will be signed in Western capital, whether in Europe or Washington, then Russia will do its best to force Armenia to get a signature in Moscow by giving a certain green light to the Azerbaijanis, as maybe it happened in 2020. This is my assumption. It's not based on information. But this is my assumption. This is maybe where we are heading. Regarding the European narrative, sure, they used the term Aghdam Road, and then many European officials, they said, no, Aghdam Road will not be an alternative to the Perzor or the Lachin corridor, but already it's even though Pashinyan in his 5 hour press conference, he said that I haven't discussed the issue of the Aghdam, but it was clear that the Azerbaijanis have discussed the issue of Aghdam with the Europeans and also Lavrov. It's interesting how gradually, literally, someone should make a research paper about the Azerbaijani state narrative. Like they are throwing something, and then the next day it is becoming public or international narrative. And this means that there is an agenda. It's like someone is implementing what his project, like there is an agenda, very clear agenda where they are heading, which is the depopulation of Nagorno-Karabakh, and later coming back to Sunni. This agenda is true. The problem is that it is being implemented, and they are successfully doing it. While our side, or the Armenian side, what they can do is just to postpone through negotiations the coming war, but the war will happen or something will happen, unfortunately. It's not because we have a failure or I have a lot of reservations on Pashinyan's government and so on, because Aliyev's legitimacy also comes through war. Imagine that peace will happen. Like there is coexistence with the Azerbaijanis. We are friends. We are drinking tea in Baku, and they are coming in Yerevan drinking tea. What will be Aliyev's legitimacy? The dictator. Then the people will say that, okay, we have a peace with Armenia. Now we need a democracy, human rights, and so on in Azerbaijan. So Aliyev's legitimacy also comes through wars, because this will mobilize the nationalism and so on. And even the war is justified in the Azerbaijani society. When we see the polls on the social media, if you see an Armenian kid walking, how you will react, and we see that the majority either they will slap the kid or cut his tongue. So this nationalism and anti-Armenianism is deeply rooted in the Azerbaijani society, and we cannot establish peace the next day.
And of course, it's promulgated by the state as well. We should not forget that.
Yes, it is institutionalized racism.
So last Monday, Mirzoyan and Bayramov met in Moscow. We keep referring to that meeting. So let's go a little bit in more detail. Apparently, again, no tangible progress was announced in the discussions. But they did mention that they talked about rights and security of minorities in Azerbaijan and Armenia. That's a quote.
Yeah.
They seem to be putting an equal sign at best, between the rights of refugees in Artsakh of the most recent war, about whom it is explicitly mentioned in the November 9/10 statement, and the rights of refugees from the 1990s, many of whom left Armenia on their own accord, and many who were expelled from Azerbaijan. Many Armenians. So this statement led to rumors that Pashinyan's government is discussing the settling of Azeris in Armenia by the numbers of tens of thousands. The ANCA also has in the past rung alarm bells, saying that the USAID is ready to support Aliyev's campaign to settle Armenia with Azerbaijanis. Armenian officials denied these rumors, and a deputy foreign minister also stated that Azerbaijan may be throwing up hurdles in the negotiations because they have designs on Armenian territory and they don't want to accept the 1991 borders. What prospects do you see in these ongoing negotiations for Armenia and Artsakh?
That was very dangerous, and it was one of the most dangerous things. But I am trying to convince myself that maybe Russia was trying to pressure Armenia by bringing up this so-called parallel minority issue, so that later the Russians would say that, look, Azerbaijan has compromised after the peace deal is signed, that Azerbaijanis will no more press about the Western Azerbaijan, so-called Western Azerbaijan issue, and we have established peace and so on. Because from the Russian perspective, imagine that 2,000 Azerbaijanis come to Sunik, first of all, the Armenian population will refuse, and second, the Armenian military and the army will not be able to guarantee, because every time a conflict and clash, first of all, where these people will come. I mean, Sunik is not a desert, for God's sake. And second, it means that if something like this will happen, so you need at least 20 or 30,000 Russian peacekeeping forces to secure the so-called rights and of the security of these so-called refugees. Is Russia able to send such forces? I mean, barely is able to win the war in Ukraine, to be very fair. I mean, it's adopting a mercenary policy to engage in Ukraine. Not the Russian army is fighting in Ukraine. So Russia is not able to commit itself to send a huge peacekeeping forces in also Sunik. I think this is a pressure that the Russians are trying to do, to say to the Armenians that, look, if you don't sign a peace deal now, then in the future the war will be in Armenia's territory and not in Nagorno-Karabakh. And then we have warned you and we cannot help anymore. I'm trying to convince myself that this is the issue.
Some Russian channels had actually mentioned that in the context of these negotiations about Azeri settlers in Sunik, Azerbaijan was also demanding the ability to set up some departments. And now I only read an English translation, and it said, quote unquote, some departments in order to assure the safety of these Azeri settlers in Sunik. So it gets worse from here. It really, this
first
is
of all, also, how many Azerbaijanis, to be frank, how many Azerbaijanis are now settled in Nagorno-Karabakh? I don't think the number is even more than 5,000.
Yeah, we don't know how many people are living in Shushi and Hadrut. At least I don't.
Yeah, I don't think the number is 5,000, because I'm monitoring every time, like every month, 10 to 15 people, and they are making videos and so on. If the number was 20 to 30,000, we would have seen it. So literally, which Azerbaijani, even the most nationalists, will come and want to live in a country where they will be ruled by the Russian border
But they
guard?
will if they are paid to do that.
Yes, but again, how many? But yeah, who knows what will happen in the future? Things are changing very quickly.
I think it's important to highlight that both the West, we mentioned the ANC is concerned. They wouldn't make they didn't mention any sources, but they wouldn't make an empty statement like that, where they said that USAID is actually considering helping Azerbaijan.
When the negotiations started in USA, I remember very well, it was also officially posted about the minority issue in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and then the Americans withdrew this issue. Yeah. Maybe it's Aliyev that have discussed this, and the Americans, they quoted him, or also they try to summarize the discussion. But from the Armenian perspective, of course, this is a huge threat to first of all, also in the Soviet archives, the Russians should know very well that these people were not deported from Armenia.
That's right.
No certain archive or something, unlike the incidents, the pogroms in Sumgayit, Kirovavat, and so on. This was very well intentional.
So there's absolutely no conversation about those segments of society. Over 200,000 Armenians had to leave Baku, Sumgayit, Shahumyan, and everything. Nobody's talking about those.
500,000 in total.
Yeah. But when it comes to track to diplomacy workshops that sometimes I participate, Azerbaijani experts always try to put this issue that if you want to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, let's talk about also the Zangezur and how the Azerbaijanis are so-called deported from there. So this is like from 2021, but now this became state narrative.
Yeah. In the context of that discussion, then, if they want to go back to refugees and settlers all the way back to the 1920s, should they not be thinking about maps from those periods of times instead of the 1975 maps when we're talking about border delimitation?
Maybe, but from if we talk about also 1990 map and so on, then Nagorno-Karabakh was part of Soviet Azerbaijan. So yeah, maybe they are using this as a pressure tool, exchange Sunik for Nagorno-Karabakh, that okay, we'll not return, so-called return back to Sunik, but in return, you fully recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. Maybe this is the Russians why are pressuring us. Lavrov at least made a U-turn, or Russia made a U-turn, to just give up and recognize Nagorno-Karabakh, so at least to secure Sunik and to fill the stomach of the Azerbaijanis. But the problem is that, again, Azerbaijan is the whole legitimacy of Aliyev's regime is based on war.
So let me understand this a little bit better, Yeghia. So basically, the talking points of the West and Russia. So what does Russia have to offer? Why would Russia seek to mediate these meetings? I guess you hinted a little bit to it, and basically is that the only card left in Russia's hands? Let's say they resettle Sunik with some Azerbaijanis, and they resettle Artsakh with some Azerbaijanis. Is Russia essentially trying to become the de facto peacekeeper for both areas and therefore entrench its control? And is that the only card left, or is it are there some other alternatives? And if so, then why would Armenia flock to the West? I mean, we understand that the situation is bad, but it seems like you're jumping from one fire to a bigger fire, because at least the West does not have any peacekeeping forces to offer, and it's not giving any guarantees for security, it seems.
Yes, Russia has boots on the ground. So basically, the only additional thing that Russia, as you said, it's almost the same. Now it has been almost the same, the Russian and the Western proposal. But the only additional point is that the Russians have boots on the ground. They have peacekeeping forces, something that the West doesn't have, and something that the West is not ready to provide, at least based on my information. I'm not sure what is being discussed behind the scenes or the doors. Because if they will send the peacekeeping forces, then you have to convince the Russians to leave, and you have to convince the Baku that an international peacekeeping force is coming. And when you are internationalizing the Nagorno-Karabakh, it means you are giving something like a Kosovo status indirectly. This is something that Azerbaijanis will never ask for it. They would prefer to cooperate with Russia and sign a bilateral agreement, because this is also what I think, that if a peace deal will be signed, instead of the trilateral agreement, a bilateral agreement will be replacing. That is, Nagorno-Karabakh will no more become something interest of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, but it will become something into internal debate between Russia and Azerbaijan. So basically, Armenia will be excluded. And this is what the Azerbaijanis are waiting. They are saying that this is our sovereign territory, that is our sovereign territory, while Armenia wants to intervene in our domestic affairs. This is the Azerbaijani perspective. So basically, I can say, yeah, it's almost the same, but because Russia has a peacekeeping force on the ground, this is the only leverage Russia can do on Azerbaijan and Aliyev, and force both to sign an agreement.
Okay, so as the critical situation in Artsakh becomes even more dire, this weekend, Aliyev seems to have pulled off another feat in international propaganda. He was able to invite a group of 250 journalists representing 50 media outlets to Shushi for a so-called media forum. Some attendees reported that all of their expenses were covered. And while many of the attendees were bloggers or social media influencers, the meeting unfortunately did include some big-name organizations, legitimizing the oppression going on just a few kilometers away from them. Pro-Azerbaijani Russian journalist Igor Korochenko was there too, and received special applause and thanks from Aliyev.
And Asbed, I want to add to that Annalise Borges was also there. She's from Euronews, and just today, Pashinyan announced that he gave an interview to Euronews. So the same person who was writing glowing remarks about visiting Shushi and participating in that propaganda forum, all paid by. Of course, I don't know if her coverage was paid, but other people have reported that their coverage was fully paid. So potentially, we have that person who was influenced by that Shushi media forum interviewing Pashinyan today.
Yeah, I was interested in knowing if either of you know if this coverage was actually picked up by Russian media. Was it a do in Russia?
So I'm not sure, because I couldn't, but I know that from the TASS, which is the state media in Russia, there was also Mikhail Guzman. It was also there just a few hours ago. Lindsay Snell, she published on her Twitter account the whole names, the full name of the experts. There was also from Serbia, which was interesting. There's also additional two people from Russia, a military expert, Igor Korochenko, and also Sergei Markov, a political expert, who is expert also South Caucasus. He was also there. And the others, of course, from some Arab countries, Lithuania, Turkey, of course, a lot, USA, UK, and so on. So basically, I think also it reminds me of in 2015, when we were commemorating the centennial of the Armenian genocide in Yerevan. Turkey also initiated the 100th anniversary of the Çanakkale, or the
Gallipoli.
Gallipoli, exactly, against the British attack and so on. So they try to pass in order to shift the public attention. This is what exactly Aliyev is doing, and I think he will have more initiatives in the future because there is now literally starvation in Nagorno-Karabakh in order to show the world that how Azerbaijan, like, is prosperous country in media, in and so on, and likes to bring diverse opinions and so on. So he's trying to whitewash his image through mercenaries. I can say mercenaries, not independent media experts.
Hovik, you watch a lot of videos. Did you see if the Russian media covered this event?
I mean, I think that the issue is not covering the event. It's who was present, how legitimate it was, and these people who are present are influenced and later would produce pro-Azerbaijani content. Yes, there was some coverage about the event, but that I don't think that's primary here.
Okay, well, Yeghia, we've talked a lot about the Armenian community in Russia. It has traditionally been reasonably influential, but most recently it seems that Azeris have gained a significant advantage and are using it to advance their political interests in Russia. Is this a function of the Armenian community becoming more inert, or is it Azeris becoming more activated? Or is it a function of the geopolitics of the South Caucasus leading the local politics in Moscow? What do you think?
Of course, I cannot generalize based on two trips that I have conducted to Russia, one in Pyatigorsk in the south and the other one in the north to St. Petersburg. But with some contacts with Armenian friends, community activists and representatives, let's say, there was this concern even from them that despite the fact that they have access in the Russian public sector, in the universities, like, for example, the vice rector in the Pyatigorsk State University was an Armenian, but they are not able to lobby or raise their voice publicly out of a lot of concerns.
Why is that?
When I remember, so there was this Middle East expert forum, around 14 or 20 maybe were from Russia. There were 3 or 4 Armenians, ethnic Armenians. And when a Turkish guy was there, he was using the term Zangezur corridor. I was the one who jumped in, and I was representing Lebanon, not Armenia, and said that this is wrong, and the others were silent. Maybe it's self-censorship, which is, I think it's a bit overdose. I mean, you can talk freely in Russia when it comes to these issues. You can debate. But they were maybe trying to be shy and so on. And also when it comes to political lobbying, the committee should do much more. Yes, I know. We know that Russia is not USA, but at the same time, when we have good presence, literally good presence in academic circles, in the think tanks, and so on, they are doing the minimum.
Okay, I think it's important to cover the situation in Artsakh. To begin with, this week, a special committee that was created by Pashinyan for the purpose of aiding Artsakh back in December was revived from hibernation. And it announced that it was going to send a huge humanitarian aid convoy, 400 tons of aid. Of course, that's like 1 or 2 days of consumption in Artsakh. But they did a huge PR promotion around it. It was organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Edmund Marukian and Vahan Kostanyan, Deputy Foreign Minister, were at hand to escort staff of foreign embassies that were stationed in Yerevan to the Kornizor area. And at each point, they said, well, now the convoy is in Vaik. Now the convoy is passing by Goris. And for 6 days now, the convoy has stopped in the Kornizor area. And it became obvious, at least to me, that there was no negotiations and there was no agreement by the Armenian government with either the Russians or the Azerbaijanis, at least nothing apparent, that this convoy was going to be allowed to go through. I know you may not be an expert in this area, but what was the purpose of organizing this convoy if, like many say, that there was no previous agreement to allow it through? Because Azerbaijan, as soon as it was announced, Azerbaijan, even before the trucks left Yerevan, Azerbaijan announced that it will be seen as a provocation.
As you said, I totally agree. It's just a PR. That from the Armenian perspective, they try to corner. It's laughable, of course, but at least from a media perspective, let's say they try to corner Azerbaijan, saying that look, guys, this is the true face of Azerbaijan. We are sending humanitarian aid to Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. And when the Azerbaijanis initially, if you remember, at least 2 months ago, they were saying that there is no blockade in Lachin, everyone can pass, and now they proved literally that look, there's a blockade, and the Azerbaijanis are not giving green light so that these cargo trucks pass to Stepanakert or go to Stepanakert through the Lachin or Petrol corridor. Instead, what the Azerbaijanis are asking for is that such aid should go from the Aghdam route, and Azerbaijan should provide aid. I mean, imagine like you are providing. I mean, imagine the Nazis are providing aid to the Jews. So, like,
Right.
I'm gonna kill you, but please eat from my pizza. This is what is happening. I mean, it is a media success. If, of course, this media success is translated into lobbying and lobbyism in the European Parliament when it comes to sanctions, even though I don't think that the West is ready to sanction Azerbaijan, but from my perspective is that, as I said before, that if Russia succeeds in bringing Armenia and Azerbaijan together to sign a peace deal, through war, that is by giving a certain green light to Azerbaijan to engage in a limited war to force Armenia to sign this, then the West will not directly accuse Armenia, but it will accuse Azerbaijan of failing the Western-backed negotiation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And then the West and the USA, they will feel maybe a bit humiliated or offended by Azerbaijan, and they will take action. Again, this can be a wishful thinking.
And of course, things do get worse because not only aid, but the passage of people was not being allowed for a long time. And now on Saturday, we learned that a 68-year-old elderly Armenian who was seeking medical treatment in Yerevan, and that's the only reason why you can go to Yerevan escorted by the International Committee for Red Cross. Mm-hmm. He was stopped and he was basically abducted. There was reports that the ICRC representative was pushed out of the car.
Yeah.
We have this series of podcasts with Yeghia Tashjian. I mean, we talked about this multiple times, but we had said back in early June that these checkpoints, if allowed, would basically be a place to officially kidnap Armenians and make them disappear.
Exactly.
And this is happening. And, today we learned that even the false charges that Azerbaijan presented were wrong because it was someone with a completely different name. But that's not important. The important thing here is that the principle that people cannot go unfettered. Yeah. Critic of the government, Edgar Ghazarian, said that nobody who fought in any of the wars, and even all those who were drafted and even did border guard duty, even women who may have served in government posts or in civil service would be vulnerable to future such kidnappings. I know this is a difficult question, Yeghia, but where are we heading? Is there a way out of the situation? If Armenians somehow say, okay, let's use Aghdam, these kidnappings won't stop.
There's also this concern that if the Lachin corridor now is opened and the checkpoints are released, there will be mass exodus of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. At least this is what some Russians also told me. There's this concern. Of course, this does justify what is happening. But let's remember that when there was the COVID lockdown, how many months we survived locked in our houses? 1 month, 2 months, and later everyone started having psychological problems. I remember that I was talking alone in front of the mirror, literally. So imagine 2 months alone. I mean, in the house, you cannot go to the beach, you cannot go to the mountain, you cannot go to your workplace, and so on. So literally we'll go psychologically crazy. And this is what Azerbaijan is doing. It literally transforming Nagorno-Karabakh into concentration camp, impose psychological pressure on the Armenians. And I'm very afraid that crimes may happen in the future, because when you don't have a food and you have family, you have kids, and they need milk, you will do everything. This is why when the financial crisis in Lebanon started, and when it reached to its peak in 2021, 2002, there were a lot of crimes, there were a lot of domestic violence, because people literally want to feed their kid. They were killing their neighbors. And this is what Azerbaijan is pushing, literally pushing the destruction of all institutions of Nagorno-Karabakh, and by cutting. I don't think that the Lachin corridor will be opened or unblocked diplomatically. This is for sure. They will not do it. If I was Azerbaijan, I would not do it. So I'm sure they will not do it. They will try to legitimize the issue of Aghdam Road, and then Nagorno-Karabakh will be fully dependent on Azerbaijan. Maybe they will open the Lachin corridor only if they get something in return, which is the route in Syunik. So they will do the so-called Zankin corridor or route parallel to the Lachin corridor. So basically, there will be no Zankezo corridor. It will be a route, and there will be no corridor in Lachin. This will be somehow, from the Azerbaijani perspective, maybe a so-called win-win scenario that they can also sell it for domestic consumption. The Europeans are saying that we don't want the Aghdam route to be an alternative to Lachin, but we can also discuss the opening of Aghdam. Maybe there will be two routes. And this is what the Russians, they are trying to convince maybe the Azerbaijanis, because the Russians, they also want the Lachin corridor to be open to facilitate the military supply if something happens from Armenia to Stepanakert to send aid. If they will use only the Aghdam route, they cannot send any military supplies anymore to Nagorno-Karabakh.
Well, speaking of helping Karabakh, this week, the citizens' initiative Hayakve has reached a critical goal weeks ahead of its deadline. As of July 29, 54,800 citizens signed the petition, 24,600 from Yerevan, 29,300 from the regions, and 760 people signed it electronically. The petition is still open for joining in order to ensure that there is enough buffer to account for invalid signatures. So if you are a voter in Armenia, please consider this and go to the website. It's hayakve.am, hayaqve.am. Hovik, if you are a diasporan who is living in Los Angeles or anywhere else outside of Armenia, what are your options for voting electronically?
There is a electronic voting or registry system. It is mainly used for paying taxes, and there are a limited number of Armenians who have registered. I know there is a way for you to enable your ID so that you're able to sign electronically. What I don't know is whether you need to be present in Armenia to do that enablement. However, if your ID is enabled for electronic signatures, then anywhere from anywhere in the world, you can sign this petition on the Armenian government website, and we'll link to that from our show notes.
Great. Okay. Well, let's just wrap up our topics here. I want to ask each of you if there's something on your mind for this past week that you would like to talk about. Hovik, what's on your mind this week?
So I wanted to pay our last respects to Lieutenant Colonel Hovik Manucharyan, who was in a coma since 2019 when he was brutally beaten in front of his home in Yeghia by the former aide to the Voivode store Artsakh. There were some allegations that the Artsakh himself was present, but of course, according to the testimonies, that didn't happen. And 1 week after this incident, the Artsakh resigned, only then to be appointed as an MP for the civil contract, in the national parliament. The recognized culprit, the deputy Artsakh, was sent to jail for 5 years. Meanwhile, the culprit's brother was exonerated. The culprit's brother was somehow implicated as well, but he was exonerated. So only one guy went to jail for this, and for only 5 years. And unfortunately, the victim passed away. I would consider him another victim of Nikol Pashinyan's civil contract. And my respects to his family and Armenian men and women in uniform who don't deserve this kind of treatment.
Yeghia, anything on your mind you'd like to share?
Well, to jump a bit to Lebanon, maybe. We discussed a lot Armenia. Today, finally, the head of the central bank, it was his last days. So his mandate ended and he left the central bank. So now we don't have a governor of the central bank, not just a president, but also no governor in the central bank. And let's see what this will happen and its impact on the financial crisis that Lebanon is experiencing from October 2019.
All right. Thank you, Yeghia. We'll leave it here for today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. We hope you found it useful. Please follow us on social media. We'll talk to you next week.